Welcome to Study Loop.
In this question, we're going to consider two separate scenarios. The first scenario is that a drought around the world raises the total revenue of farmers. Well, let's show what a drought around the world looks like. For this, I would safely assume that the aggregate sum of farmer output is subject to inelastic demand. And just for the sake of clarity, I'm going to assume we have perfectly inelastic demand for food in general. Whereas the supply function is still subject to well-behaved parameters. So if we have a drought around the world, that would be represented by a leftward shift in supply, which, if we had perfectly inelastic demand, would not affect the equilibrium quantity, but would increase the equilibrium price. And then in this case, we would have that the new total revenue exceeds the old total revenue. But if we considered the case of a drought only in Kansas, and we looked at the total revenue that Kansas farmers receive, well, up here we did the world market for food, which has inelastic demand in general. But if we look at the market for food from Kansas, well, all of a sudden, these consumers purchasing food have alternatives. They have substitutes. In particular, they have food options from farmers grown in neighboring states. So the demand for food specifically from Kansas wouldn't necessarily be inelastic. In fact, because of the high substitutability of food between the states, you would argue that it might be elastic. If that's the case, in other words, if demand for Kansas food is elastic, what this means is when Kansas farmers experience a drought, we actually are going to reduce the equilibrium quantity. And recall that if we have, in particular, elastic demand, this implies that the resultant price increase coming from the drought is actually going to reduce total revenue.